Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to Nodes and welcome to our next video on our JavaScript stories. And today we will move on to other advanced fundamentals of JavaScript. Okay, so let's get started. So here you can see that I'm having a couple of slides, right? So once we cover the slides, the theory, then we will move on to our practical demonstration to understand that how hosting works under the hood. Okay, so let's move on. So here you can see that I'm having my roadmap side of things, and we are done with these concepts here, right? So we have completed all these, and now we are on our station number 2, in which we have totally understood about the global execution context, and today we will be covering about hoist, right? So let's move on. So here you can see that it's just a recap of the previous concepts which we have discussed. So you can see that we are having our call stack, right? So we have discussed this example in the previous video, in which we know that how call stack help us to execute the JavaScript code, right? So here you can see that I'm having a function test, which is again calling a function test2, and that test2 is having our log, which is called, and finally we are calling our main function test. Okay, so as we all know that for the first step we will be having our call stacks, right? So this is our call stack on step number 1, this is our call stack on step number 2, and this will be our call stack on step number 3, right? So we will be moving from step number 1 to step number 3, right? So the very first thing we know that before even a single line of JavaScript is executed, the JavaScript engine pushes the very first thing on the call stack, which is known as our global execution context, right? So on step number 1, the global execution context is pushed, and after that on step number 2, we know that the code execution will start and the test function will be pushed onto the call stack side of things, right? And once the test function starts executing, we know that further this test function is calling another function which is known as test2. So the test2 function will be pushed onto the stack side of things, right? And once the test2 is done executing, we will get the output of console.log called, and then this test2 will be popped off, then this test will be popped off, and then finally when everything is done, this global execution context will also be popped off from the stack, and our program will finish, right? So this is the overall concept of a call stack, right? For understanding the global execution context or any execution context, I need you guys to remember these 2 points. Okay, the very first point is that for every function call, JavaScript creates a new execution context. Okay, so for every function call, or I would say for every function which is pushed onto the call stack, JavaScript creates a new execution environment, and that environment is known as the execution context, right? So just keep in mind that whenever a new function is pushed onto the call stack, so JavaScript creates a new environment in which things are way different from the previous environment, right? So that new environment is known as execution context, right? And the second point which I want you guys to discuss is that each function call in the call stack is isolated with the rest of the others, right? So keep in mind that whenever a function call is on the call stack, right? So whenever a function is pushed onto the call stack side of things, so this is way isolated from the rest of the other functions which are available on the call stack, right? So right now just assume that these are different, I would say, universe, or I would say these are just different planets which are residing on the same universe, right? So this test2 thing or this test thing, it's way isolated from rest of the others, right? So this is the second point which I want you guys to remember, right? So let's move on. Okay, so let's understand what the execution context thing is. And in the previous video we also discussed that execution context has 2 different phases, right? Number 1 is the creation phase, and number 2 is the execution phase, right? So just assume that the creation phase is just some steps. So for every execution context, JavaScript go from 2 different phases, right? Number 1 will be the creation phase, and the second will be the execution phase. Okay, so just assume that creation phase is the point where you plan for how to execute a JavaScript code in the new environment. So that is known as our creation phase, right? So this yellow rectangle is our main execution context, and inside this we are having 2 steps. Number 1 is the creation phase, and second one is the execution phase, right? And we all know that in case of global execution context, we will be having this and the window object, which are provided by the global execution context, right? But there is a second step which is also involved whenever JavaScript creates a new execution context, right? And the second step is known as hoisting. Okay, this is what I'm going to say is hoisting, right? So this is where hoisting comes into the picture, right? So let's understand what hoisting is, and before going on understanding what hoisting is, I want you guys to remember that whenever JavaScript creates the new execution context, hoisting is performed, right? Because we know that for every execution context, the very first thing is the creation phase, and inside that creation phase, hoisting is a must process, right? So now let's understand what this hoisting thing is, right? So let's move on to the next slide, and here you can see that I'm having this hoisting thing right over here, and I'm having a left triangle. Okay, so just keep in mind that hoisting loves two keywords which are present in JavaScript. Okay, and those two keywords are this var keyword and the function keyword, right? So these are the two keywords which are present in JavaScript, and I would say that hoisting loves these two keywords. And why I'm saying that is, let's bring in the definition of hoisting, right? So in hoisting is a process in which you reserve memory for variables, and especially those variables which are created with var keyword, and we also reserve memory for functions which are defined with the function keyword, right, before the execution of single line of code in creation phase, right? So the reason I'm saying is that hoisting loves these two keywords of var and function is because whenever a new execution context is created, we go into the creation phase, and inside the creation phase, before a single line of JavaScript is executed, what hoisting does is it will reserve memory for variables which are starting with the var keyword and for functions which are defined with the function keyword. Okay, so this is the overall concept of hoisting in JavaScript, right? So let's jump on to the next slide, in which we will discuss the practical example, right? So here you can see that I'm having a code snippet right over here, in which we are having a log variable which is defined globally, right? So it will be attached to our global object, we know that, right? So what I'm doing is that I'm logging that global variable before defining it, or I would say before declaring it, right? And then I'm also logging that thing after declaring and defining that. Okay, so and then I'm having a function call which is having call me, right? The function name is call me, and inside call me I'm having another variable, and I'm doing the same thing with this name variable as well. Okay, I'm logging it before the declaration, and then I'm logging it after the declaration and definition of that name variable, right? And inside this call me function, I'm having another function, and inside that function of inside, I'm having an inside variable, and I'm doing the same thing right over here. Okay, and moving on, you can see that on the outer global side, I'm calling this call me function, and I know that whenever this call me function will be called, then the very first thing I know that the call stack will push the global execution context. Then we will be having our call me function, right? And once the call me function is done, I know that when it comes to this line right over here, it will call the inside function right over here, and this inside function will be executed right over here. And once the inside thing is done, we will just push it off, I would say pop it off, and then the call me will be popped off, and then finally the global execution context will be popped off, right? So here what I'm trying to say is that whenever a new execution context is created, the hoisting will look for two most loved I would say keywords, right? Number one will be the var keyword, the second one will be the function keyword, right? So what this will do is whenever the global execution context is pushed in the creation phase, it will go and look for the var and function keywords, right? So this one is the var keyword, right? So it will go and will reserve a memory for this variable of global, and second is it will go and look for the function keyword, in which it will go and reserve the memory for this function keyword as well. Okay, so this is the concept over here. Okay, and let's say when you call this call me function, at this point you are creating a new execution context right over here. Okay, and whenever this new execution context is created, we know that the hoisting process will go again, right? So whenever you call this function right over here, then the hoisting will look for the two favorite keywords, right? The var and the function thing, and it will go and reserve the memory for this variable name and this function inside for this execution context right over here, and this memory will be reserved for this even before the single single line of execution starts, right? So this is the concept right over here. Okay, so yeah, I think we are done with the theory side of things. So let's go practically, just copy paste this example into our WebStorm, and let's see that how things work. Okay, so since you guys know that majority of the time I'm using, I would say, VS Code, but I'm switching from VS Code side of things to WebStorm. The reason is because WebStorm is a full-fledged IDE, right? And when it comes to IDE, you know that you get a lot, I would say, features as compared to VS side of things. And I know that VS Code, or I would say the WebStorm is paid, right? But I would say it's value for money. You get a lot of productivity when you're working with WebStorm side of things, right? So that's the reason I like the products of JetBrains, and I do like to code on these platforms, right? Okay, so let's start. So yeah, it's a simple thing. Over here you can see I'm having my index.html file, which is plain index.html, and which is being linked with our main JavaScript file. and this is our main.js, which is having the same code snippet which we have covered right now in the slides, right? So let's see, let's start debugging. So let me just create some breakpoints. So this is our first breakpoint. Let's see, I'm going to see that how things will work before declaring and how things will work after declaring that variable. Okay, so let me place the breakpoint something like this, and inside this I will also place on this to check the name variable how it behaves, and then I will also push it something like this. Okay, so these are the variables I like to place the breakpoints. The reason is we will be seeing that how hoisting works, right? How it will be working before the I would say declaration and then after the declaration, right? So let's also keep a breakpoint on this call me function right over here, and yeah, let's keep a breakpoint on inside function call as well, right? So let's right click and let's debug our main.js, and what this will do is this will just spin up a browser and it will start debugging right on the spot, right? So now at this point you can see that the code execution is, let me just make it simple. So here you can see on line number 1 the code execution is stopped on our global variable, and right now you can see if I hover on this global variable, you can see that this is saying me that this one is undefined right over here. Okay, and even if you come to our debugger console and if I just type this global thing, okay, and if I press this enter, okay, you can see that it is showing me that this is undefined, right? And even if you come to our this threads and variables, you can see the very first thing which is pushed onto the call stack is our anonymous, which is our global execution context, right? And if you search for this global keyword, you will find that this is being attached to this window object, right, which is our global object, right? And this is what hoisting is, right? So even before declaring and defining those variables, JavaScript interpreter goes and reserve memory for this global keyword, right? So at this point JavaScript should throw an error, but it's not throwing an error, and the reason is due to hoisting, right? Because JavaScript knows that this global variable exists and it exists with the value of undefined, right? So hoisting, whenever you declare the variables, I would say when the variables are hoisted, they are assigned the value of undefined by the JavaScript engine, right? So this is the concept hoisting, right? And even at this point, I told you that hoisting loves two keywords, right? Number one is the var and the second one is function, right? So if you see that this function thing right over here, this is at the global level, right? So this function should also be hoisted at this point, right? And you can confirm it from, I would say, if you just scroll this functions right inside our main scope, you're seeing that this call me function is also being attached to our global object, right? And even you can call this function, right? So if I come over here, if I say this, or I would say this dot call me, you are seeing that this dot call me function is existing at this point right over here. So at this point JavaScript engine knows that what the global, I would say, variable is, right, which is undefined. It has already reserved the memory, and same goes for this function call as well, which is our call me thing. Okay, so let's move on. Let's see. Let's move on to our our next step. So let's see how the debugger performs, right? So let's go to our next step. So let me just click on next, and now you can see that at this point I am on line number 3, in which now JavaScript knows that the value for our global variable will be this global thing right over here. Okay, so now if I type this global, okay, and enter this thing, this will result in global because the value I have assigned right over here. Okay, so now the assignment is done. So let's go one step further. Let's see how things work, right? So let's go, and now we are calling our function call me, and you know that whenever a new function calls is done in JavaScript, so JavaScript creates a new execution context and again go through those creation phase and the execution of code, right? So in the creation phase, I know that again it will hoist those things, right? So if I go one step further inside this function, let me just make it small for now. At this point I know that this function from this curly bracket to this curly bracket right over here is a different execution context, right? So again the JavaScript will hoist inside this execution context, right? So at this point I'm assuming that JavaScript must know about the name variable or must have allocated memory for that name variable as well as for this function inside, right? So let's check this in the console. If you come to this function side of things, you're seeing that yeah, this inside thing is existing right here. Okay, so the function is being attached, I would say the function is being hosted, right? And let's print this name thing. So if I type name over here, you can see that this name is also being hoisted, right? If I just enter this thing, you can see that right now it will be undefined, and the reason is because just the memory is allocated and the value is undefined while we hoist those things, right? So that's the concept right over here. Okay, and same goes with the function, right? So if I type, let's say, this, and if I type this dot the function inside, you can see that this will give me IntelliSense for that. Okay, not here, maybe in the debugger console. So if I come over here, I say this dot, let's say, inside. Okay, and this should give me the function. Okay, so yeah, this might not be attached to the global object, right? So in that case, it should be simple inside. Yeah, you can see that right over here. The reason it is not being attached to global object is because we are in a different execution context, right? So yeah, we are having this inside thing, and it is giving me the complete IntelliSense, right? So this means that this inside variable, inside function is also hoisted, as well as this name thing is also being hoisted, right? So let's move further and let's see how things are working, right? So let's go one step further, and now you can see that we have passed our declaration and assignments, and now JavaScript engine knows that the value of name is afaq, right? So let's go one step further now to this line right over here. So now we are having another function call, which is this inside, right? And we know that a new function call means a new execution context, right? So let's go and see that whether hoisting again starts or not. Okay, so if I push into the next step, you can see that at this point this function is being called, has been called. So this is pushed on the stack, and I know that the hoisting will start again. So at this point, if you hover on this, you are seeing that this is saying undefined, right? So at this point, JavaScript knows that their value of inside is undefined because it has to go again to that hosting process, right? In other programming languages, we know that we cannot call a variable, before we have defined or declared or assigned that value, right? So those programming languages throw error, but in JavaScript, for special keywords of var and function, we can do that, right? And this is known as the concept of hosting, right? So at this point, you can see that the inside function, I would say the inside variable, is having the value of undefined, which is being hoisted, right? So that's the concept over here. Okay, so let's move on to next step, or I would say right now we know that the inside value is past the declaration and assignment, so it is having that value right over here. And at next point, I know that the code execution will be stopped and everything will be popped out of the call stack side of things, even the global execution context, right? So that is the concept of hosting, right? But let me just give you a glimpse of how things look when you go to the official documentation. So let me just bring our Google Chrome side of things, and let me just exit from our presentation mode if I can. So let's exit presentation mode over here, and let's bring in our Chrome if I can. So let me just right over here. And if you come to hosting in JavaScript, and if you come to the official docs which are from Mozilla, here the definition might be a little different, right? So it says that JavaScript hosting refers to the process whereby the interpreter means the JavaScript engine, right, move the declaration of functions and variables, classes, or imports the top of their scope, right? So this is how I would say most of the interviewers define while they are explaining hosting. But under the hood, the reality is that before the code execution, whenever a new execution context is created, JavaScript is just reserving the memory for var and function keywords, right? So that is the reason that you can call a function even before I would say before declaring and defining it, right? So that's the reason you can access a variable before even declaring or defining it. Okay, and that is the main concept of hosting, right? So under the hood, it is not physically moving those declarations above the code. It is basically, I would say, reserving the memory before executing the code. Okay, so that's the reason JavaScript knows whenever you access that variable or function before declaring it. Okay, and in case of variable, it's undefined, but in case of functions, you will be having a complete function call, right? So every code inside the function will be I would say hosted at the top. Okay, so that's the concept of hosting. Okay, so yeah, if you're liking my content, do like and subscribe the channel. I think that's it for now, and see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.